Howdy my totally as always Tubular Gamers, and we're back with, you guessed it, another ranking video. And today we're talking Godzilla. Yeah, you know Godzilla, your mom, your dog, your friends, your adopted friends, everybody knows Godzilla. I mean, Godzilla is one of the most iconic monsters, creatures, really just anything in media, whether it's the movies, the TV shows, or the video games. Godzilla is known all around the entire world. And like I said, Godzilla's been in plenty of video games. Godzilla really is no stranger to video games. There's been Godzilla games for like 40 years now, no exaggeration. A little over 2 years ago, I did a video talking about some of the Godzilla games, but today I'm going to talk about the Godzilla fighting games. You see, when people think about the Godzilla video games or what Godzilla games they really like, at the top of the list is almost always the Godzilla fighting games, and today, that's all we're talking, just the fighting games. We're going to be looking at all these games, you know, stacking them up worst to best, seeing how they all go against each other, giving them all a little review. You know how these go. How much fun are they? How in-depth are the mechanics? How replayable it is? I'm not the biggest fighting game aficionado. I'm going to be looking at these games with a pretty casual lens, seeing how I think they've aged, how much fun I've had with them, some memories, etc. Now, something worth mentioning is there are a lot of Godzilla games with fighting mechanics, but I wouldn't necessarily call them fighting games. Games like Godzilla on PS4, where yes, you do fight other monsters and it can kind of be like a fighting game, but I would not say that's a fighting game. I would say a game like Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee is a fighting game, where fighting is like the only thing you do, and it's really built around that. So if there's a game missing from here and you go, oh, you're missing this game, like Godzilla PS4, it's because I don't really consider it a fighting game. It's a game with, you know, some fighting mechanics in it. Now, Godzilla has a lot of games that never made it over to the West. They stayed in Japan, and you know, usually on my channel, I do not cover games that only stayed in Japan. However, for this video, I am going to actually make an exception, and I will include one Japanese Godzilla game. The one exception I'm making is Godzilla Kaiju Dekesen, also known as Godzilla Monster War, because it's just that good. Any other Japanese Godzilla fighting games, well, sorry, you just didn't make the cut. So today we're going to be looking at Destroy All Monsters, Save the Earth, Battle Legends, Monster War, both versions of Unleashed, and Domination. And so, you know what, this intro's been long enough. Let's just get right into it. Like, share, comment, sub. Let me know your favorite Godzilla fighting game down below, or some fun memories you have with these games. Let's get some of these games to Evo, and yeah, let's get into it. What do I think is the weakest of all the Godzilla fighting games? And so here we have Godzilla Domination releasing for the Game Boy Advance. Now, I know based off the cover art, you might think this is just Destroy All Monsters Melee released for the Game Boy Advance, but this is actually a pretty different game. It's a totally different style of fighting game. This game plays a lot more like King of the Monsters from SNK way back in the day, and there was even a second one. And you know, this game, it's not as advanced or as good as King of the Monsters. I mean, King of the Monsters was great. And that was also for arcades versus GBA. Look, this game, what it is kind of an isometric, just button mashing brawler where you play as Godzilla or a couple other monsters and just beat the shit out of each other. Eventually, one of you is going to go down, and then, you know, you move on to the next fight. There's a nice little arcade mode you can go through, and eventually there's a boss you fight at the end. Usually it's Mecha Ghidorah. Now, when it comes to the roster, I gotta say, it's pretty weak in this game. Like, it's the weakest of really, like, any Godzilla fighting game. It's one of the reasons it's so low on this list. You just aren't getting much here when it comes to the roster. And when it comes to the fighting mechanics, I mean, it's a Game Boy Advance fighting game. I don't know what you were expecting. I'd rather play this than Tekken Advance, I can give it that. You know, it's really basic, there's not really any combos or strings, and you just kind of button mash and hope you win. I mean, you can do like air attacks, you can do ground attacks, and that's pretty much it. You know, I didn't come here expecting to have my world blown by just how amazing Godzilla Domination is on GBA, but, you know, the game looks pretty decent for the GBA, it sounds nice, and I think it still plays alright. I mean, I still have had some fun with this game over the years, and I can say this is a lot better than a lot of other Godzilla games. Like, this game could be so much worse. Would I say you should go play it right now, go find it, even if you're like a huge Godzilla fan? No, I could say you could probably skip it, but like I said, this game could be so much worse. At least what we have here is a decent little GBA game. And so here we have Godzilla Unleashed, but we're looking at the PS2 version. A lot of people aren't familiar with the PS2 version. The PS2 version of Godzilla Unleashed is actually different from the Wii version in a number of key aspects. I will say the story is the same, it's still this convoluted mess that just doesn't really make any sense. But when it comes to the gameplay, when it comes to the roster, it is different from Unleashed. The biggest difference from Unleashed's roster is that it kind of sucks, actually. It's legit only half as big, and it only has one new character from the previous game, Save the Earth. That's Batra, who is just a clone of Mothra, even with the same moveset. So the whole roster just feels incredibly gimped compared to the Wii version, and I wouldn't even say it's any better than Save the Earth, which came out years before this game. Now, when it comes to the fighting mechanics, it is kind of like Unleashed on Wii. I mean, you don't have to use the Wii remote here, so you're using, a PS2 controller, but it just controls terribly. Like, it feels awful. Out of all the 3D Godzilla fighting games, this is the worst feeling of them all. Like, it doesn't feel satisfying, it doesn't feel smooth, it feels just really awkward and clunky the entire time. None of the combos feel nice, and the game just feels like it's moving in slow-mo sometimes, more so than any other 3D Godzilla game, and the game just doesn't have the variety that Godzilla Unleashed on Wii had. When it comes to the presentation, it somehow looks worse than the Wii game, which didn't look all that great to begin with. This game just doesn't really have a ton going for it. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is still some fun to be had here. You still are these giant monsters destroying a city and each other. It's just, this has been done so much better in every other 3D fighting game that features Godzilla. And so with that in mind, I just can't recommend this game. I think if you're going to play Godzilla Unleashed, you shouldn't even bother with the PS2 version. And so here we have Godzilla Battle Legends. It was released in America just as Godzilla, but yeah, Battle Legends. It was released in '93 for the Turbo Duo, which is a pretty obscure game console that I don't think like anybody has. I think this is the first time I've ever talked about any kind of TurboGrafx game, and it's going to be the only one for a while, unless we're looking at Castlevania. So Battle Legends is a pretty basic fighting game. It came out in '93, so I wouldn't expect greatness here, but really the game is about Godzilla just going up against all of his foes. There's, the single player and the multiplayer. However, in the single player you can actually only be Godzilla, which is a bit strange, but in the multiplayer you can play as way more characters than just Godzilla. A bunch of iconic monsters are here, a better roster than Domination, honestly. What is kind of cool is that when Godzilla fights a certain foe, his appearance will actually change to reflect the era when he battled it in certain films. For example, Godzilla looks like as he did in 1955 when he fights Anguirus, but then he actually changes how he looks if he fights, say, Rodan from '64, which I think that's actually a really good touch. It actually shows the evolution of Godzilla. There's plenty of different Godzillas in this game. When it comes to the actual fighting, it's a pretty basic stiff fighter from the early 90s. I mean, I wasn't expecting anything, all that amazing here. I was like, okay, if this is a little less stiff than like the first Fatal Fury, we're off to a good start, and it was a little less stiff than that. There aren't really any combos you can do, but I'd say the fighting, it still felt okay. It has not gracefully aged, but I think this could be worse. In addition to just, fighting the monsters, there are some bonus stages. I just don't really know what's going on with them, but there's some bonus stages you can do here, and the game isn't too long. You can probably finish it in, 45 minutes or so. Now, like I mentioned, there is the multiplayer mode, but I have unfortunately not convinced or coerced any of my friends or partner to play this game with me, and I don't expect that to change, so I don't really have anything to comment on there. But I think, given its age, that it's actually even this much fun really says a lot to the game's quality, because, yeah, I did actually have some fun with it. I had more fun with it than I expected. And I'd say all in all, this is one of the more underrated Godzilla fighting games. I mean, I'd say like every Godzilla fighting game is underrated to an extent, but I think even in the small circle of Godzilla fighting games, yeah, this one's a bit underrated. Should you go play it? I mean, if you download an emulator, you could probably download a lot worse things to your computer. I had more fun playing this game than mining cryptocurrency, so, that's gotta say something. And so here we have Godzilla Unleashed releasing for the Wii. This is the third in the 3D fighting game series with Godzilla, and I remember getting this game, not too long after it released, and actually having a really great time with it. I know there are a lot of people that don't really care for this game, especially when compared to some of the other 3D fighting games, but I've always had a good time, and I think it still is very playable nowadays, and a lot of fun can be had with it. Now, this game tries to build on the previous two games with its roster, and I'll just be real, this game just goes balls to the wall nuts with its character roster. It has easily the best character roster of any Godzilla video game. There are so many characters here, there's so many iconic monsters. There's over 30 monsters in this game, and not all of them are just Godzilla. Only a couple of them are Godzilla. It is just crazy big, and I think every Godzilla fan can appreciate how big the roster is and just how many monsters got into the game. But what could you possibly be doing with so many monsters? Well, you're going to be beating the shit out of each other. Of course you are. What else are you going to be doing? Now, when it comes to the fighting, I'll be the first to admit, this game does not feel anywhere near as nice as Save the Earth or Destroy All Monsters Melee. It just doesn't. And one of the big reasons is because this game was released on the Wii, so you knew it had to have some motion controls. And the motion controls, you know, they're not the worst. They are not the worst. They're a bit finicky, but I remember getting used to them and actually thinking they were pretty decent, and when I've played this game with my friends, you know, they agree it's not the worst. It could be a lot worse on the Wii. There are a lot worse instances of the motion controls ruining fighting games. This is not one of those games, but thanks to that, they did kind of compromise on the fighting game aspect where there's not really any combos. It doesn't feel as nice. It really feels like it's lacking some of the depth from Save the Earth, and it just all around feels a bit sloppy. And I'll just be real, the targeting system, I just don't know what went wrong here. It's just kind of ass. Like, whenever there's more than one monster that you're fighting at once, the game just doesn't really know who you're trying to target, and will just have you constantly switching back and forth from attacking. In a one-on-one setting, it's best, but when more than one monster gets involved, that's when, yeah, it just gets sloppy and overly chaotic. Additionally, the game plays and just feels a lot slower and a bit sluggish compared to the previous two games. Like, the pacing, it's just not so good. But I'd say the fighting, it still gets the job done. There's still some fun to be had here, and it's all right. There is like this whole campaign mode that you can play through with all the different monsters, and there is a story here, but I'll be real, this story is just... it just is nonsensical in so many different ways. It's just like all over the place, and even all these years later, I really just still don't get it. But there is a story mode to play through here, and you do more than just fight all the other monsters. There actually are some side objectives, and you get some other type mission types where you have to destroy the area. And I mean, these I don't really care too much for. I think the game is best when it's fighting. When you're fighting other monsters, like, that's when the game's at its peak. The destroying the other stuff, it's whatever. This game, you know, it's got some ups and downs, and a lot of people called it a mixed bag, but I still did have quite a lot of fun with it. The roster, and really just how much fun the multiplayer can be, just saves it. Oh, and the soundtrack, I cannot believe how good it actually is. It's just really good. Presentation-wise, the game was fine for the Wii. All in all, I can still recommend the game. It does have some caveats, you know, but if you love Godzilla, there is no reason you shouldn't play this game. That roster alone makes this game worth playing. If you are looking for just a fun little multiplayer time, yeah, I think it's still worth trying. And so here we have Godzilla Kaiju Dekessen, also known as Godzilla Monster Wars, releasing for the Super Famicom back in '94. This was the Japanese only Godzilla fighting game that a lot of Americans, really Westerners, really wanted to try, and we just never officially got it. But I'm including it here because this game just absolutely kicks ass, especially for the Super Nintendo. The game is kind of a follow-up to that Godzilla Battle Legends game, only I'll just say immediately, this game feels so much nicer than that game. It controls a lot better, it's a lot smoother, and it plays actually really similar to some of the old Dragon Ball games or Street Fighter 2. I'd say Street Fighter 2 is a fair comparison, but each monster actually has a bunch of different attacks, whether it's your standard or unique attacks, there's special attacks, there's actually button inputs that you need to do for some of these special attacks, and you can even block. And I really gotta say, I'm still shocked with how well this game has aged. Like, it doesn't feel super stiff, it actually has some flow to it, the pacing is alright, you can do combos, there's button inputs for a Godzilla game. And one of the biggest things is that every monster feels incredibly different to play as. No two monsters feel the same. They actually really went out of their way to make sure all of them feel totally different, like, say, Street Fighter. You know, there's Godzilla here, there's Angrius, King Ghidorah, Gigan, Megalon, Mechagodzilla, Biollante, which was a really strange choice, Mothra, another Mechagodzilla, Super Mechagodzilla, and even Gotengo. Like, the roster, you know, it's not the biggest, there's not every monster, and there's not a ton of versions of these monsters outside of Mechagodzilla, but I still think it was pretty strong for the time, and the biggest thing, like I said, all of them feel incredibly different. Even the Mechagodzillas feel different from each other. Still don't know why they included Biollante, though. Like, seriously, he was like one of the weakest monsters in Godzilla history. We're Space Godzilla, but you know what? It is what it is. The roster, I think, while it isn't the most in-depth, I think everyone is extremely varied, and again, they all feel different from each other, which is a huge thing. There's, the typical arcade mode in this game, and you can go through it with any of the monsters, not just Godzilla, and it's not the longest. I mean, it's a Super Nintendo fighting game arcade mode. I'm not expecting an hour or two here. It's like 30 to 45 minutes. It's the multiplayer where this game excels. There is just a ton of fun to be had here, because it doesn't matter if it's 1994, or if it's 2004, if it's 2054. This game is still going to be fun in the multiplayer, and the fighting is still going to be an enjoyable time. The game looked great for the time, it sounded great, there's a ton of fan service to all the monsters and the movies. It really did capture the vibe and aesthetic, I feel, for the old Godzilla movies. And plenty of people nowadays are like, they need to remake this, remaster that, re-release this. How about we get a localization for this game? How about we finally get this game to come officially to the West and get it released on some modern hardware? Like, I think people would really appreciate it, just as a classic, fun, throwback fighting game. I think people would actually really like it. This game, it kicks some ass, unexpectedly kicks a lot of ass, to the point where I'd say this is one of the very best Godzilla games, and I have no problem saying, if you like Godzilla, if you like old games, if you like old fighting games, check it out. Absolutely check it out. You will not be disappointed with this one. And so here we have Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee for the GameCube. I'm sure plenty of people have nostalgia for this one, and I do as well. I played it back when I was a kid, and I thought it was great then, and even nowadays I'm like, no, this game absolutely still holds up. So this was the first Godzilla 3D fighting game developed by Pipeworks, and this game was exactly what people have wanted forever from Godzilla, at least in the West. They want just a fighting game where Godzilla and a bunch of other monsters show up and just beat the shit out of each other, where it really just captures the vibes and the atmosphere of the old campy Godzilla movies, and you're just leveling cities, you're fighting each other. There's a good roster of monsters here, and they're actually all really well realized with a bunch of fan service to them. Like, none of the monsters feel compromised or like they're missing moves. Like, they've all got their lasers, they all have their special abilities that made them so unique in the first place. Like, this game has a ton of fan service, and if you love Godzilla, particularly the old movies, there's really no way you're not going to love this game. You can do more though than just beat the shit out of each other. You can really level the city, you can pick buildings up, you can toss them, you can stomp on everything. Like, the game is just incredibly satisfying even all these years later, and it still feels great. I think the controls still are responsive, it's intuitive, it's easy to pick up and play. You can understand the controls pretty much right away, but you can actually get kind of good at it, have some combos, some strings if you will. It's nothing crazy here. I mean, you fly into the air when you beat the crap out of monsters, so there's not a lot you can do, but it actually, it's easy to pick up and play and understand, and it's still a fun time. This game's also probably the fastest Godzilla fighting game. I mean, it's a hell of a lot faster than like Unleashed, and it's got actually pretty decent pacing to it. There's more than just the fighting here. Like I said, you can destroy buildings, but there are a few other mini games where you destroy stuff, but nothing too special. Look, if you haven't played Destroy All Monsters and you consider yourself a Godzilla fan, no, just go try the game, get some friends, probably a GameCube or an emulator, whatever it is. Just try Destroy All Monsters Melee, because this game, it has a ton of fan service. It doesn't have the biggest roster or the most in-depth roster, but the fighting mechanics still hold up. It's not the most advanced, but the game is just a blast to play. I've never not had a fun time with Destroy All Monsters Melee. It is still such a good game. But here we have Godzilla Save the Earth for PS2 and Xbox, which I believe to be not only the best fighting game Godzilla's ever had, but the best Godzilla video game, period. Save the Earth is just a superb time. If you like Destroy All Monsters Melee, this is that game, but just a little bit better. The game doesn't reinvent the wheel for Godzilla fighting games. It really just takes Destroy All Monsters Melee and just builds on top of it. The actual fighting mechanics are very similar, but they've added more combos, more characters, more environments, more variety, more. They've got a lot more characters here. I didn't think Destroy All Monsters Melee had the best roster, but this game, it really included a lot of the missing characters to make one of the best Godzilla rosters of them all. A bunch of my favorites are in here, and I think some of the additions are pretty awesome. When it comes to how the fighting feels, it feels very similar to Destroy All Monsters Melee. It is not as fast, it is a little slower, it is a little more campy feeling, I guess, in that sense, but it still feels really nice. It's easy to pick up and play and understand, but you can actually do some pretty neat things once you start to get pretty decent at it if you play it for even more than like 20 minutes. There's more combos here, there's more moves in general, there's just a lot more options you have when you're fighting another monster. But there's more than just fighting another monster. There's actually a decent amount of other modes here. There's more mini games, there's more things you can do, and I've actually had some fun with these with friends as well. They're just goofy little mini games, but I mean, it's funny like that they put something like this in here, and it's so absurd that it actually makes it a decent time, like where you're trying to basically play basketball and you're throwing these balls into the hoop, and it's just funny. Something else that's crazy is that you could actually go online with this game. Back when Xbox Live actually existed for the OG Xbox, you could fight people online in this Godzilla game. Like, you can't even do that nowadays, but you could do it back in the 2000s. I wish I could have played this game online because I think that the fighting is actually really solid and the game is just a blast. I said it back a couple years ago, I'm going to say it again. Godzilla saved the earth for EVO. If we could get Shrek Super Slam and Def Jam at EVO, I think we could get Save the Earth there. Godzilla needs our help because Save the Earth is just a blast. The game absolutely kicks ass. It has a great presentation. It has good music. It has a solid roster, good fighting mechanics from, a non-fighting game expert like myself, and it's just a great time. Is it the most balanced? I'm not really sure, but I have no problem saying that this is one of my all-time favorite fighting games, and if you're going to play one game from this entire list, or you're going to play just one Godzilla game period, it's going to be Save the Earth, because that game is great. It's probably gotten really pricey now. When I bought it well over a decade ago, it was like 30 bucks. I'm sure it's tripled at this point. The game desperately needs a re-release with online play, I will add, and I would be there day one if they announced something like that. I absolutely would be there day one. I love Godzilla. I like all of these games to an extent, but Save the Earth has a really special place in my heart. And so that's why I'm going to end today's video. Hope everyone has a wonderful day. Subscribe if you liked the video. If you made it to this part of the video, comment bricks as in what Godzilla is going to destroy. That doesn't really make any sense, but bye-bye now. Hope everyone has a good one. See ya.